I am the co-moderator for this panel, and I would like once again to welcome you all. I'm Vice President of HVD with Joanne. I would
like to say hello and welcome to the English people here and I apologize that everything's in French this morning, but I'm so happy that you came and that you're getting a simultaneous translation. I feel sorry for the translators because it's going so fast, but I would never be able to do it. But bon courage.
So good luck to the interpreters. Unfortunately, we have to go really quickly, but everybody's got very interesting things to say. Each one of the people who is speaking could speak for hours, but the idea was to give you as well the opportunity to be heard and to interact with our experts. But before starting our panel, I would like to show you a video by Mr. Daniel PILOTE. Daniel is a young resident in a long-term care facility, so it's important that a resident also has a right to speak. He's a president of the Mesures collectives pour l'autonomie au Québec, and he did about 40 videos. We've chosen one, and he's done one especially for us today, and I'm very pleased to tell you. And it's on his experience with daily life in a long-term care facility. So I think it will add to what Yvon has said. So the video, please. Hello, and welcome to the guests and members of Handicap-Vie-Dignité. For the past 4 years, I've been a resident. I'm 56 years old. I'm in a long-term care facility in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu. I have muscular dystrophy, and that was diagnosed when I was 11 years old, and I'm almost completely paralyzed. I have a degree in financial services, and I worked in the banking industry. I'm involved in all sorts of organizations, such as Mesures collectives pour l'autonomie au Québec, for the rights of handicapped people and people who have lost their autonomy. I am a spokesperson of the Council for the Protection of the Ill or Patients with Maître Paul Brunet, and involved in the class action suit against the long-term care facilities. I know the president, Joanne Ravanda. I've known her since the beginning of January because she saw me on Facebook with my videos, which are called Mr. P. I started these videos 2 years ago to denounce the conditions in long-term care facilities. Every week, just about, I present my videos on Facebook. So I'll tell you honestly, things are not going well for the elderly in long-term care facilities. I believe that the previous government had the pink glasses syndrome. They said things are going great. Several points that I've been repeating over the past 2 years: the lack of staff, of frontline staff, absenteeism, and the list of replacements are the points that we need to improve, because staff is burnt out. replacing is inadequate. The replacements are inadequate because of the regions, the large regions. In the 6 regions, we need a list of replacements for the institution. There are 2 seasons that are horrible for the residents in long-term care facilities. That is winter and the summer, with vacations. And also, in addition to this, in the winter, there's the flu season. I've noticed that there was a staff turnover, a very high staff turnover. The abuse that is not intentional provokes, with the staff, it pushes them to act. They slam doors and equipment. The staff is not named when they give care. There is no knowledge of the service plans or the care plans or the work plans. The team spirit is non-existent. There is no recognition system for employees. The caring hours versus a number of employees. There's also the position of services where we've used another term, so orderlies for food services. And I think that they will have to be trained or retrained. The assistance course for people in long-term care facilities will be able to be done by a work-study program so as to compensate for the lack of orderlies. Positions should be attractive and well-defined so as to avoid this high staff turnover. The food services have to be reviewed because the menu is not as was promised. The residents have the impression of being just objects. For economic efficiency goes beyond a humanized system. Almost half of the budget for Quebec is allocated to health. That is $42 billion. And we absolutely must organize it better. We have to take care of our healthcare system to treat residents well. I want us to improve our healthcare system, and I want, first and foremost, in-home care, in-home support for beneficiaries and carers that is at the height of our expectations. In the last recourse, the choice of location of the long-term care facility, they should have adequate care and support. The government and the management must consult residents to negotiate any decisions so that together the well-being of the residents will be done with respect and dignity while upholding our rights. I thank the members of Handicap-Vie-Dignité. I thank you for your work, and I thank the participants for being here, as well as those who will listen to us on the webcast.
Je pense que
Thank you. I think that Danielle is on the line with us. Am I right? So if you are listening, we would like to thank you for having taken the time to present your ideas so well. So I think that's a very good start because it really represents the reality of many, not all, but many who have seen this reality. So I will also tell you that I visited a good friend of mine this week. I asked her the question. I said, "You'll surely give me an answer of about the long-term care facility where she is." She said, "Daphne, I think it's like a five-star hotel here." So there are very different situations and different opinions depending on people's expectations and what facility they're in. So this is something that is not tolerable. I will leave that up to discussion. And now I have a great joy in passing the microphone to my co-host at the end of the table, Madame Christine Maître Christine Morin. Maître Morin is an associate prof at the Faculty of Law at the Université Laval. It is my alma mater as well. She was also a fellow of the Chaire of Research, Antoine-Turmel. She'll also talk about the subject of the panel, how the panel works, present all the panel interests, all the panelists, and the questions they will answer. Thank you, Christine. So hello everybody. I'm very happy to be here this morning with all of you, given the importance of the subject of the discussions this morning. So I'd like to remind you that we are in the presence of 5 speakers who will speak to you for 8 to 10 minutes each. They're timed, as you saw this morning. Thank you, so that we don't have to do it. So 8 to 10 minutes each around questions that were prepared in advance by HPD. And then there will be some time for questions from the floor, questions that you have written down. So I will now let our first speaker take the floor, Maître Paul Brunet. He is a lawyer, president, and representative for the Council for Protection of the Ill. He is that and much more. I invite you to read their bio. There's a bio there on the programs. I'm just going to present them very briefly. I don't want to impede on their time, but they all have very impressive resumes. So for Maître Brunet, we know that the resident committees exist everywhere in the healthcare system, but their power seems very limited. So HVP asks you what your vision is and what should be its power in your opinion. Well, thank you. That's very simple. It is in the law, despite what all the different people have said to obfuscate and to try to put us to sleep. What the roles of the committee are written in the law. They're enshrined in the law. Nobody can overrule them. They are mandated by law. And so to promote the users' rights, defend the rights of the users, and inform the users and the families of the rights of the users. It's written in the law. Nobody can stop you from doing that. But in all these years, we've said all these different things. We've intimidated committees to tell them that we work with the minister. You will not make trouble here. So there's a lot of pedagogical work that needs to be done, because from now to the 15th of April, there will be formation of committees to determine their role. They've been told all kinds of things, and so Benoit Rasset, that forms the committee, and how to militate and function with the committee, not militate in a violent way, but to advance the work and the cause at hand. So that is why we are here, and the mission of the committees. It is not to fill out annual reports with 5 annexes. It's to be the mouth and to speak for the people who cannot speak. So to be a partner, not somebody who's subordinate, somebody who's below you or subject to your power. These are adults who are conversing one-to-one, man-to-man, woman-to-woman, with respect of the law, respect for authority, never complacent with their administration of their duties. Why am I saying this? Because it is my brother who is at the heart of the introduction of this kind of committee in the law. I think that we know more than anybody, that we can tell you all kinds of stories. What is the role of a users committee and a residents committee? And I think since this morning, those who did not know, now you know. You know that you have a role that is very important, very noble, and I hope that we will continue to encourage you to play your role with organizations like HVD and the Council for the Protection of Sick Persons or Ill Persons. So I have to leave. I have another meeting. This is what I came here to do this morning. I wanted to deliver this message. Thank you. So thank you, Maître Brunet, for this first comment, so that others will have 11 minutes less instead of 10. But I will let our second speaker take the microphone, Anne Bourbonnais. She is a prof and president of the Chaire of Research for Healthcare for older persons, for the elderly at the University of Montreal. So, Madame Bourbonnais, the question that HVD wanted to ask is, how can we optimize the practice of nurses in long-term healthcare facilities to favorize approaches that are centered on the person-centric approaches? Thank you, Maître Morin. So thank you for the invitation to speak to you today about nursing the elderly. I worked as a nurse a while ago in the long-term health care facility. I loved working with the residents, with their families. Today I am a prof and a researcher, but I still miss some of that experience, and I remember these people, and it guides my work as a researcher. When I was working as a nurse, I was really shocked sometimes by the care offered by some of my colleagues, the orderlies and auxiliary nurses, and sometimes I admired their skills as well, their creativity and their capacity. And I was curious. I wanted to go read and understand what the patients were going through to give them better care. And I thought it was frustrating because when I thought something was working well and I gave them some ideas, and the colleagues, some of them didn't want to know anything about an approach that was more person-centric more than task-centric. So I denounced some practices that I thought were unacceptable. I didn't really make friends that way. I had some colleagues who followed my lead. They thought we were a bit annoying. They sometimes tried to intimidate us also. That reflects sometimes what the families go through. And so for me, my role as a nurse was to defend the interests of the residents. And I've chosen to do some research on long-term care because I had hoped that it was possible to change things, to improve, to reinforce practices. So I know there are things that are not going well in some places, but I think we can improve, and where we can maybe share these practices. So I can say that my colleagues and we were positive deviants. So the word deviant can be seen as a negative, but in healthcare it's a concept where we say that there are people in a context that is not ideal can do better than others in the same conditions. And I thought that it resembled what we did in long-term healthcare facilities and what we see in many facilities now, or there are people who can do great things in suboptimal conditions, sometimes hostile conditions. So in my case, we were lacking resources, but it was important for us to be creative, to defend our ideas, and to be motivated in looking at new ideas and new ways to do things. And so why some of us become positive deviants and other ones no, I don't know. But something maybe that is aligned with our values, possibly, certain personality traits maybe, but also our clinical knowledge and our ethics that helped us to identify solutions that were more relevant to better accompany residents and to question practices that were sometimes not person-centric enough or that were taken as a given. So it was easier to convince people when we were together rather than me alone. And I noticed that we needed a certain number of persons that would follow our practices so that our ideas can take hold. So the problem is that in these long-term health care facilities, there are a lot of people. So being able to work together to change practices is like a big ship to try and turn around a ship. So it explains the disparities between the different centers. But when we want to favorize an approach that is more centered on persons and families, we meet with a lot of obstacles. Obstacles, I think, that come directly from the nurses that have an individual responsibility, some organizational obstacles as well, and probably a social aspect in all of this as well. So for meetings at the individual level, they have practice guides that tells them what they should do and what they shouldn't in long-term health facilities. What is quality practice centered on the person that exists? But there's also the frame of reference that was published last year by the Ordre des Infirmières du Québec that has the mandate of protecting the public. That clearly described what is the expected role of the nurses in long-term health care and to optimize well-being and favorize the recognition and development of capacity of residents and families. So it's not that we don't know what they should do. The question more is what should the nurses do to be able to accomplish what we expect that they can. So first they have to have a certain skill level to work in this area as in other areas. And I would say even more so because people are vulnerable and but it is very important in long-term health care. And Monsieur Riendo had mentioned it. We need a leadership to mobilize these big teams because they are sometimes smaller than the nurses, smaller in numbers. They have to develop their skills. That is a responsibility. Also, I remember the nurses that go to that were in the emergency room, they're very much admired and they saved lives and we admire them for that. But when we say that we are going to work in a long-term health care, they're not as admired. And I think we should admire them because they save people's quality of life. But I never heard that really. And when I have a nurse, when I said I was going to go work in a CHSLD, the welcome I got was, well, you're good. Why do you want to change diapers coming from a colleague that came from St. Justin Hospital that change a lot more diapers than we do. She was in pediatric care, so I was very insulted that they would think that I would lose my skills in working with a complex clientele that had important needs and had a lot of autonomy. So I think the long-term health care centers value the work that we do, and I think that to have personnel that is well-trained, that will give time and space to this personnel to be able to play their role. So if you have good nurses, but we make them do other things that has nothing to do with their role, they will go elsewhere or they will be happy to do simple things rather than things that demand leadership or clinical judgment or orient the care in an appropriate way. So we have to find nurses that have these characteristics, positive rebels, and we have to encourage that. And the nurses also have to want to play this role. And organizationally, of course, the CHSLD, the long-term health facilities, there's these practices centered, people-centric practices. We see that in certain units and others. It's discouraging. But the managers at CHSLD have to push the nurses to play their role and have a practice that is centered on patients and their families. Or if not, we should train them to do this right. And I'm not just talking about making sure that the food and hygiene is good, but it's much more than that. We have to make sure that the nurses can optimize the capacity of people and be in a quality of relationship, to work on the quality of the relationship as well. So we have to push these aspects and have expectations at that level, and we could also say that the managers should know the framework that they have to work under, their role, because when they do, when we have inspections in long-term health care facilities, that's the document they will base themselves on. So maybe we should make sure we give them a context and a framework to work under. So a frame of reference. So maybe the residents and the families should also get to know this document so that to understand what is expected of the nurses, and so they could communicate those expectations so that the nurses can demonstrate and live up to those expectations, and maybe put some pressure on the managers as well to that effect. So I think we have to understand that it's difficult. Change is difficult sometimes. It takes time. You need the means. So sometimes the nurses don't really have control on the elements that influence the quality of their work, so you have to consider that. But I think you have to have a high ideal, a high standard, so we can reach as high as we can. So from a societal standpoint, of course, society also has a certain responsibility, because we don't really value older folks or handicapped persons in general, which means we don't value the care we give to these persons as well. So it's difficult to find nurses that are competent, that will want to go work in these establishments that have a bad reputation in general. Some of them are very good, but others no, and there's a generalization that happens there. So it's difficult to get a nurse to go work there when she won't be recognized for her skills. So we have to denounce what is unacceptable, value the initiatives that are positive, encourage that, and everything that is human that demonstrates competence should be valued and encouraged, as we saw before. So I think that giving care for auxiliary nurses, and orderlies, it's an art, but it's also a science. There has to be knowledge there, and we should not trivialize the skills and the knowledge that it requires. So if we do that, we trivialize all the care that the residents will receive, and their families as well. So what I hope for a lot of people, for a lot of us here, is that we have a lot of positive deviants among us, and that the standard would be that the positive rebels will stop being the rebels and start being the norm. So thank you, Madame Bourbonnais, for this wonderful view on nurses. Does somebody want to react to that or add to that, or do we save that for the end? I would rather keep that for the end. Okay, perfect. So I will now welcome Yvon Riendeau, that we had the chance to hear from earlier. I remind you that he's a social gerontologist, a sexologist. He is a trainer and also is a prof at UQAM in social gerontology. So we will hear Monsieur Riendeau on this question. So how does the academic reality of the orderlies reflect the reality of their work in long-term care? Can you just remind people? They have to write down their questions. So for the question period at the end, we will privilege the written questions. So please write your questions down or ask for help if you need help from our volunteers, and we will manage the question period with the written questions that we will have received. So please give your questions to, this is inaudible, so if you heard that, we want you to give your questions with the paper to the volunteers. You have to raise your hand if you've written a question. The teams can come and get it, okay? Thank you. So, Antoine. So, 10:07. Maybe to start, we should remember that the training of PABs in Quebec, of orderlies in Quebec, has gone through major transformation. For a few months now, we are in the new iteration of the training that is called Assistance to Persons in Establishments and at Home. There is now a professional training for orderlies and service providers, A3Ss, so clerk service that provides service. So Couturier and Aubry have done a study. We have 53% of the orderlies right now in Quebec that have professional training, a DEP, and professional training, and it was launched in 1986 by the government of Quebec, because at the time there was zero. I've been 40 years. I started 40 years ago. There was no training. It was another time. It was really another time. But in 86, we found ourselves with 0 to 54 hours of training. We went to 54 hours of training. It was not huge, but it was a start in public. For the public system, in private institutions, 54 hours plus 1 week and then 330 hours, and then there was 1 week of internship, and then we said that the training could develop in 630 hours to 630 hours. So there's a lot of orderlies that have a training of 630 hours. Then there was the 750, and then from this year, initially, as I said, 870 hours for 2 training. So there's a support now to train people. We're talking a lot about health care, CHSLD, and all of that. And you're talking about the law on social services, like the main part of the practice and and this notion of law that is taught in the education in the program. So the AMV to environment and living environment approach, the environmental, the quality of life environment, and that's the frame of reference we're working under. It might change in a few years, and so PIB beneficiaries for orderlies, and so the needs of Henderson and the needs of Maslow, they will be very strongly taught. Maslow and Henderson, 1952. The pyramid of Maslow is very, very strong and really inculcated in the training. The Kubler-Ross approach, the stages of grief, very present also in the training, and the gerontogeriatric approach, the geriatric approach, everything around different approaches and different techniques with people with cognitive dissonance, cognitive issues, and so dementia and things that take up 65%. We talk about Alzheimer's. So there's something starting from that is more and more present in a varied way for different working areas. And so the profession, it's a 30-hour training, and so I'm not going to give the training course now, although the profile.
Pour être PAB en
And so for what do we need to be an orderly in 2018? And so it's very difficult. You see here on the screen the hard realities of the work of an orderly with everything we talked about since this morning and this afternoon. I'm convinced we're going to talk about that. And so the relationship aspect is a very important aspect on the knowledge of self, very important. The communication as well, and communication that is adapted. Not only adapted to the clientele, but and the Becker model. So we not just for the different profiles physically, but also palliative care and everything around the clientele, around healthcare and cognitive deficit. Relational approach, again, it's a very important module. It's a 60 hours, mental health, mental issues, intellectual development, gerontogeriatry. So the list is long. So adapted approach. So I was a bit conservative. The clientele that is in long-term health represents what are the different dementias, Alzheimer's type, or we understand that the cognitive deficit is omnipresent. So there's an emphasis to ensure the room to ensure very important emphasis for the future. So I would say what we were presenting up so far is also the same thing that we have since 2007. So for 10 years we've been swimming in these waters. The needs of the clientele, mental health and physical health. So everything that is around the human body, everything that is around the problems of healthcare and associated illnesses. So I will go very quickly. So infections, viruses, universal measures, asepsia, very important measures for safety. So the PTSD, you see that post-traumatic stress disorder. So the PTSD is 120 hours. That's a training course, PTSD, the material in the course, everything around care for the residents, different profiles, with simulations, with simulated environments. We work with real people. Yesterday I got shaved because we shave real people. We have real guests. We don't have real people, but we have tried and get as many people as possible that come to help us to give the orderlies the best quality of training possible. End of life and palliative care, grief and all that, the medical assistance for euthanasia. So people who work in the residential private Bill 90, invasive care and distribution of medication. So I'll give you about the third of all of it, and the last part on the bottom, first aid, and then green, and a lot more, plus 3 internships, 1 in the hospital, 1 in long-term health care and long-term care, and 1 in a CLSC. So the training of the orderlies to conclude is the training for specialized care. So the training and warnings at different dangerous situations. I don't want to be pejorative here, but we're talking about professional ethics, and so maybe some lacking in ethics in different long-term care. We're talking about working environment that is desirable, what is undesirable, even before the internships. And we're also talking about metacognition, knowing yourself, self-knowledge, self-examination, self-awareness. We're really talking a lot about metacognition, and also the compassion, altruism, and tact with different situations, simulations with different videos and capsules, and my friend who appears in the videos, the culture of blame. We talk about that because there's the omerta, there's the thin white line that we are denouncing this culture of secrecy. We talk about that. We have some seminars on that. We also talk about the social perception of the orderlies. I hear everybody. I see this in literature. I read the newspapers. I hear what people say, whether it be a TV station or a newspaper or different TV programs. We see it on the news often. And I'm sorry to say this like this, but it's they are targeted. They have a big target on their backs, and they're orderlies. So we always talk about them in terms of mistreatment, and they always are the scapegoats. And I'm not saying that because I like saying that, but it's really a social reality. So when I do the work on this subject, and so some people say, Monsieur Riondo, we don't even know if we really have a future to take over. We have a future. We have a future generation. I'm excited to say that more and more our students are future orderlies, 18, 21, 24, 25, 30 years old, some of them. So there is a future. There's a next generation coming up. It's very interesting, but also this next generation must be, as I said, trained very well and thinking not only on their tasks. They must not be task-oriented. It's about 40% of the training. 60% of it is attitude and thinking and the way we do things. We also talk about organizing work, as I talked about this morning, the 3 shifts, a 24-hour clock. We talk about a hierarchy of needs, and a hierarchy. We're talking about also leadership, democracy, horizontal democracy, but also hierarchy and verticality of the system, depending on certain positions and certain hierarchy in the system. So the management of staff, management of stress, a lot of quality. We are talking about quality a lot, as you know, and I'm sorry to say it this morning, but a little bit of the omerta. We're talking about the omerta, the law of silence, and so those who know the situation very well in the between the orderlies, somebody who wants to denounce, and so it's sometimes you try to denounce these things, and there's some bullying that happens and some mistreatment, so that we're trying to encourage people who want to be whistleblowers, so that we can get rid of bullying and the negative situation that goes around it, and so to be valued and value others. So as you see this morning, 5, 10, 15 minutes, we talked about that. If one day the leadership nursing is really long-term care based, so if one day we really take on leadership and the personnel, the support staff, if one day we have video to teach all of this, to value people, to raise awareness, we will have better environments for long-term care. The last slide, the training, as we know, is for adults who want to help but also care for. These are 2 important vectors. The care is very much at the center of our training, but the assistance to others in respect and dignity. So I think we talk about all these elements, all these ingredients to get to something that is significant. 90, 80 some odd school boards. Some school boards have 20, 21 groups. Others have 2. Some of them have 6. We have no control on what is said once the doors are closed. Of course, the teachers have some reign on that, but it's obvious that more or less we're trying to not just do important work, but with a clientele and students that will jump headlong into a difficult profession. I'm not afraid to say that. Very difficult, sometimes unforgiving in a environment where the recognition they receive is not always there, and certain of the residents as well. So that said, they sometimes feel dispossessed or lost. We are working on. We're talking a lot about quality in the context of 2018. So it says FEND, and I'm stopping.
I want to announce, for those of you who have written questions down, can you raise your hand at any time, and our volunteers will come get your questions. Not to ask a question, but to give your written question, and we'll come by during the next presentation. So during the question period, we will already have all the questions. Thank you. So I thank Mr. Riendeau for this presentation. He's always very dynamic, and I hope that I'll have the opportunity to hear him talk about accelerated training for attendants, which we heard about in the media this summer. So I'd like to have his opinion on that later. Without further ado, I'll present my next speaker, Daniel Genot. Mr. Genot is Director of Advisory Services and Psychogeriatrics, Teaching and Consulting, so the CPEC. They offer consulting services that are specialized in managing difficult behaviors with people who have cognitive deficits. So, Mr. Genot, the question that was prepared for you is, we wanted to hear what you had to say as to the optimal approach, and we would like you to explain how we can implement this in environments where they use a lot of medications, such as these. Hello.
Bonjour.
Hello. So I thank the organization for inviting me to speak on this panel. I'm very impressed. It's an honor. So the optimal approach. Over the past 30 years, I've been working as a neuropsychologist in psychogeriatrics with people who have behavioral issues and cognitive decline. And a large part of the consultations that I was involved in had to do with care, like baths and bathrooms where people were aggressive, agitated, etc. And every time that I met the care teams, I would ask them, how's it going when you have to give this woman a bath? And people would say, oh, it's hell. She refuses. She hits us. She scratches. She yells. And then after the meeting, there was always an orderly who came to see me and said, well, I don't have any problems with that woman. And when I went to see why they didn't have any problems, I realized that it was their attitude, their approach, the climate in which the care was given, the way that they got consent. And I realized that that is what we had to develop to prevent agitation during care. I'm often told that residents are aggressive. I prefer to talk about defensive behavior because they feel like they're being aggressed in the way that we give care. And the optimal approach, I didn't reinvent the wheel. It's something that I did according to the observations with these orderlies who knew how to go about things. And of the different trainings that exist in the U.S., in France, in England, in the U.S., for example, battling without a battle, which was bathing without a battle. There were some publications. They've got trainings that were broadcast in all the U.S. nursing homes. The optimal approach, essentially, what is it? Well, it's an approach that is centered on the person, which puts the person at the center of the care. So a sentence that residents, so they're not objects of care, but subjects of a meeting in which cares will be offered. Offered because they can say no. They don't have to participate. So this approach occurs in one day of theory or more if we need an update, and 2 or 3 days of practice where we accompany the orderlies when they offer care by offering them at the beginning of the stage to make a list of the patients with whom they have difficulty. They are the ones that we use to implement the approach in practice. So saying is good, but doing is better. And when they see the gentleman who usually hits them, when he says thank you with a big smile, it really touches them, and that can change behaviors instead of just saying, here's how you must go about doing this. The optimal approach is an approach in which there is a meeting. We don't just go into somebody's room, bang, bang, hello, I'm here to come and wash you. We have to introduce yourself. You have to have a meeting. This is a person that we're meeting. The notion of consent is very important. I asked myself, why did we offer so much care without consent? And I remembered, did I ever go to the doctors and he asked me, Mr. Genot, do you consent to an exam? This never happened to me. The doctor says, take your clothes off, and I do it. And there's a very simple reason. If he asked me, do you consent to my examining you, I would say to the doctor, why do you think I came to see you? There is implicit consent in our care between people who don't have a cognitive decline and a carer. I'm here for this, so I consent. But an elderly person who's got a cognitive deficit, they'd not consent to being there. They may not even know why they're there. And now we walk in as if we had implicit consent. But that's false. We need consent. Consent that will be implicit through their attitude or explicit through their words, but we need consent. Also, we have to take into consideration the physical comfort. Is it nice to get a bath with equipment or a shower when we're cold? It's probably not very nice. And there are techniques to increase comfort and decrease agitation. And in some cases, we can think about the bath, the towel bath, a technique in which people are washed with a non-rinse soap, and we envelop them with a massage technique. It's kind of like a spa. A woman after one of these sponge baths said today was a wonderful day. And it's nice to hear these types of comments after receiving these types of services in a care setting. And self-esteem, if you knew the number of actions that we do every day that take away the residents' self-esteem. Somebody said, I'm telling you that when you go into a long-term care facility, you're nothing. We lose our identity. We lose our value as a person. We become an object. But I've got the conviction that if a nurse cannot do nursing work without having a list of medications and diagnoses, they cannot have an approach that is centered on the person without having the person's life experience. And knowing their life experience helps us to reframe the relationship. And it's not just an ill person that we have in front of us. It's a person with a history, with an expertise that can teach us things. For example, if I go into a room and I see a woman and I know that she used to be a florist and there's a bouquet of flowers on her table, I know what to talk to her about to create a relationship with them. Perhaps she'll teach me something and I give her self-esteem. And the life experience allows us to understand a lot of behaviors. For example, a man came out of his room, he was walking into other rooms, he'd go into rooms and talk to people, he'd go on other floors, and we said that he was a resident who would walk around in an invasive manner, but he was a doctor in a hospital. And when they found out about this, they let him go about his business. They gave him like a false file. He took notes, he walked around, asked questions, and I said, make sure he's not a gynecologist, but let him do what he wants. So that helps us in our interventions. So the results of this training was, listen, what we're told is that we don't see the resident in the same way. An orderly one day said, I realize that the residents and us, we're in the same world. And it's a way of saying that these are people. We're told that we've cut medication before care, and that certain medications, daily medications, certain psychotropics were cut out because they were no longer useful. The personnel is more satisfied with their own work. An orderly, for example, who was 5 years away from retirement, she said, following the training, she said, I was waiting for my retirement like a prisoner in jail. But she said, but now I see the good that I can do, and I want to work a little bit longer, and that's wonderful. How to implement this in a long-term care setting? Well, listen, a director in a long-term setting explained to me one day the notion of value. He said, when you get your paycheck at the end of the week or at the end of the month, regardless, he says, there are things that you have no choice but to pay. You have to pay your rent, you have to pay for your food, you have to pay for your taxes. But he said, but you still have some money left over at the end of the month, and there we can see your values. Are you buying music? Are you buying theater tickets? Are you buying sports activities? Are you buying clothing or furniture? We can see your priorities, your values, because you've got a certain freedom of spending your money. But in a care setting, it's the same thing. Once we pay the salary, this, the medication, this, that, there is some budget left over. And that's where we can decide to invest more in staff training, to invest on decorations, whatever. And that's where we see the values of an institution. I would say that this used to depend on the values of the establishment. And I've got establishments where I did some trainings where if I would go and live there anytime because the staff has an approach that is centered on the person, an approach where they're caring for people and not just objects. But there are other establishments where we don't have these values. How to implement when we don't have these values? Well, here there are many people, if we did not have to put a budget on our taxes, perhaps we wouldn't pay them. But I think that we must have a framework, some rules as was the case for the living environment model. We know that in the long-term care facility, they had developed this living environment model with Germain-Hervé. There were wonderful things that were being done, but it was a local initiative. And then at some point in 2003, there were the government directions, and we had no choice but to adopt this model. And it was implemented just about everywhere. In the past few years, we saw that the priorities change. The managers are further away from the living environment. High-level managers, the budgets were reallocated. There has to be political will. We see it, but now the political will has to do with details. Think about the powdered mashed potatoes, for instance. My girlfriend is not happy when I say that, but I like powdered mashed potatoes, and I don't think they're terrible, and I'm okay eating them. But we put the emphasis on things that were hot topics in the media. The 2 baths. I met people who did not want the bath. People didn't want 2. Some people want 3. Can we personalize the care? Now we need 2 baths. When there's political will, we get there. We would need the act like of 1997 in the U.S., where they said for a psychotropic to be prescribed, there has to be a clinical indication that is noted and documented in the file. And if the psychotropic is for a behavioral problem, there has to be, we have to demonstrate in the file that the other approaches were not efficient. And if that's not the case, well, there was a fee. They had to pay a fee. So we need a framework. Once that law is passed, ideally, there's smaller structures and a framework at the local level as well. I'm going to finish with an example. One day, I was sitting with a unit head, and I saw an orderly go by and talk to a resident by saying tu, So I said to the unit head, I said, I don't think they're allowed to say tu to the residents like that. And she said, I know. And they had training on this, but they continue to do it. My answer was, well, what are you doing? What do you do? There are some places where there's disciplinary measures for these types of situations. People stop saying tu. So we need rules. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Janot, for this presentation. Very concrete and very inspiring. Good practices were presented, good practices that we would like to see throughout the entire network in Quebec. Now I'm going to ask our last speaker to speak to us before the question period. So Mrs. Nicole Poirier, this time. Mrs. Poirier is director and founder of Carpe Diem, so an Alzheimer's resource center. Mrs. Poirier, we wanted to hear her talk about the quality of the lessons learned at Carpe Diem, which could be imported into the long-term care facilities to transform them in human environments that would respect the rights of residents and that would ensure the well-being of the people who live there. Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm pleased to come share with you our experience at Carpe Diem in Trois-Rivières. This is a place that's been in existence since 1996, and it took us 10 years of work to try to convince the government to start up Carpe Diem. And finally, we did not get that authorization, and we started it with volunteers, family members, in an old church. I'm going to show you some pictures later. What we were told was, oh, it's not going to work because it's a bit too crazy, it's too dangerous. You want to welcome people who are ill in a real house with a kitchen, with stairs. You want the door to be unlocked so that people don't feel like they're prisoners in the house. It won't work. You are ignoring the illness. That's what they said to us. So our hypothesis was that if people live in an environment that is as normal as possible, night and day, there will be fewer behavioral problems. There will be less of a desire to leave and run away. There will be fewer people just walking about. And if the personnel lives with these people instead of being a carer, if we do our day-to-day actions with them, whether it's preparing a meal, doing dishes, it will allow their capacities to be at their very best. So we started the house like this, and given the time that I've got, I prefer to bring you on a visit of the house. There will be some answers to the questions in the video. It's interesting because these are 2 young Frenchmen who called me in the spring, and they said, we're doing a show on elderly people in different countries, 1 country a month. And we said, here, we want to come see how you do things at Carpe Diem. And I said to myself, it's interesting that young people in their 20s are interested in the reality of the elderly, of people who don't live in their family home. So this is a result of their work that we can see also on Facebook if you're interested. We're not in Quebec, we're in Trois-Rivières. We'll see you later. There are several principles in our approach. We take into consideration people's difficulties, but we orient our vision on their capacities. We concentrate on their capacities, the things that they're still able to do. There are different forms of Alzheimer's or those types of diseases. We say, so how do you keep people from running away? And I say, well, first of all, people have to be allowed to leave every day. If you go out every day, you're not going to feel like running away. And you have to want to stay. So why am I staying? I'm staying because there are good smells in the house. I stay because I'm eating well. I stay because I'm useful. I stay because people speak to me. They look at me. They accompany me because I'm not a sick person that's being cared for by other people. There's no difference between myself and others. When we look at life here, it's difficult to see who is ill and who isn't. What's upstairs? We've got bathrooms. There are cupboards. Yeah, but it's beautiful. Come see. Yes, it's very nice. You think it's nice? Well, I think it's nice. Do you want to go up the stairs now? Obviously, when we see stairs, it can scare people. I don't think I came up here. But when we know the illness and when we know what the person's capacities are, we know certain things that we need to avoid. In 23 years, there were 2 falls in the stairs. There were more falls on the floor. And then the kitchen, we were told, well, people, they're going to burn themselves, they're going to cut themselves, they're going to, the meals won't be any good. When the meals weren't good, it wasn't because of the residents. The cheese has to burn. So we need to be organized and a lot of observations because we hear the door, we have to look outside, we evaluate each person. There are some who can go walk quite far and some don't want to go walk alone, so we go with them. If we stop doing certain things, we lose them. We have to, despite the illness, we have to be able to create this relationship of trust so that they will want to do things with us and they will trust us to do things that perhaps they wouldn't have done on their own. Like I said, it's not taking risks. It's accompanying a person according to their desires and their needs. And even if there are some risks, if a man has a cognitive decline, but he's got the capacity to walk, he can face the risks. I think that he walks several kilometers a day. We have to respect his right to walk and that we get organized. When we prepare the tables or the meals, it's important that he comes upstairs so that he can be upstairs, because if not, he'll start eating or touching the tables that are already set up. We allow him to walk around the house, but we don't tell him no every time. Right now, there are 14 residents here. Among them, there are people who also go back home. There's out residents and in residents. If I'm accompanied progressively, I'm going to understand that I'm here and why I'm here. Carpe Diem means seize the day. So every morning, we look at how we're going to organize our day according to the temperature and the moment. It's like a real house. The door is always unlocked. Thank you. I would also like to thank my colleagues who are here from Carpe Diem because they are the ones who bring life to this house. So what have we learned, or what could we perhaps export into long-term care facilities? Well, some people I'm sure will say, well, people at Carpe Diem are not as ill as the people that we see in our long-term care facilities. Surely there are some people who are at the beginning of their illness, but they're all in a situation where they can no longer live at home. So perhaps they would go to a long-term care facility, many of the people, according to the classical evaluations, it doesn't look like it because we're in a real house. But you see somebody who's walking around, the man in question was in another environment before where there was only one hallway to walk. Well, obviously, at that point, we think about medical intervention because for him, it was bothering other people, and for the personnel, they couldn't just let him walk around. So, obviously, we asked ourselves, are there rights that for us are non-negotiable? There's a lady who said to me when she came to Carpe Diem, she said, I don't have Alzheimer's. She said, do I look like somebody who's suffering from Alzheimer's? I said, what does an Alzheimer patient look like? She says, it's somebody who loses her rights. So for her, admitting that she had Alzheimer's meant that she would lose her rights. So we said to ourselves, very simple rights in daily life, to get up in the middle of the night, for example. When you get up in the middle of the night, did you congratulate yourself for getting up in the middle of the night? Or did you think you were fortunate that you could get up in the middle of the night? This is a right that is so fundamental that we don't even think of expressing it. Getting up, going to the washroom. We said to ourselves, it's not going to be insomnia or a behavioral problem if the person gets up like you and I do to go to the bathroom, perhaps to eat. It won't be an exaggerated demand to ask to have a little snack at night. You'll sleep better afterwards than if you took a pill. Another right as well is to be able to, for example, express your refusal, your desire to leave, to be able to walk without being labeled. You know, the labels, the way that we talk about people is an imprisonment, the start of an imprisonment. It's an important right, a right that we don't do something on behalf of somebody else. Sometimes because we don't understand or because we lack time, we try to do something for somebody else. What we've understood is that how can we, the 3 points, we have to better train our staff. And you talked about this earlier. Sometimes we have a lack of knowledge and that leads to bad care. There are different forms of Alzheimer's. So if a person doesn't eat alone, there are reasons for this. We have to find out why. So don't do instead of them. To be more competent, to support the staff, you've mentioned this. Sometimes we're burnt out and we don't treat people well. It's not because we have bad intentions. And also, look at organization. An organization can badly treat people because of its rigidity. So just add more flexibility to the organization. You've mentioned this. So these are 3 points that are important to me, and we're always working on that day and night. My recommendations or ideas, we talked about the new government. Well, there are nursing homes that were announced. Why not take advantage of these nursing homes or elderly homes so that the government can experiment new ways of doing things? The staff needs this. If we want them to be attracted by this employment, we have to offer them something other than boxes in which they always do the same actions so that they can accompany people more generally. And also, if you're interested in this, I wrote a memoir for Bill 115. The memorandum was acting for the well-being so that we can counter abuse. And these are aspects that are more global and more precise as well, so that we can act on a day-to-day basis. So I think that we've got a new government. Now's the time to act on the political level so that things change, and a day like today, well, allows us to hope that things will change. Thank you. So I sincerely thank our 5 panelists who gave us inspiring presentations, and it's promising for the future. These are positive presentations because often we are in regrets and we're disappointed when we look at the quality of care, but there are some interesting perspectives for the future, so I thank them very much for their input. Now I'm going to ask Mrs. Nahmiash to speak to you. If you haven't given in your questions, please give your papers with your written questions to the volunteers, and we will now bring them to our panelists. I'm sorry, it's inaudible. I think she's saying there's too many questions. She's not using the microphone. I'd like to repeat. The questions can be in English or in French.
I just received, so we will go with those. At the bottom. Okay, at the bottom.
I think that we had
very interesting presentations and very different perspectives. I think it's very interesting to see the questions that you have. So as to not waste too much time, I'm going to start reading them right away. The first. Oh, it's in English.
C'est à vous, Monsieur Riando. How do we get a copy of the document mentioned by, c'est à vous, by Anne Bourbonnais? Et deuxièmement, il y a deux questions sur un, ça c'est un petit peu.
There are two questions. I think that's cheating.
We need more supervision of trainees rather than using the students to plug gaps in care. Ça, c'est à Monsieur Riando, parce que vous avez parlé beaucoup d'informations.
That's for you because you talked about that quite a bit. Do you want me to answer in English or French? Okay, in French. As to the documents that I mentioned, which were produced by the Order of Nurses, which describe the exercise of nurses that could give guidelines as to what we should expect from the nurses in long-term care facilities. The document, I've sent the link to the organizer, so it's going to be on the conference's website. It's going to be on today's website. If not, you can go. It's free. It's on the site. I think it's www.oiiq.org. So it's available. It's free of charge. And I've got it with me if you want to take a quick look after the conference. On the website www.oiiq.org. It is also on the conference's website at Handicap-Vie-Dignité. I had sent it, so you should find it on the conference's website. I'm going to go really quickly because we're talking about documents. I don't know if you know, but the two PowerPoint presentations, the first and the second one, will be sent this week in PDF version, so I presume that there will be a way to spread the information. The other element, very quickly, I loved the presentations of my fellow panelists. I think that the training for orderlies has evolved quite a bit. Over the 35, 40 last years, there are still some obstacles, and perhaps I looked a bit too rigorous before when I talked about the leadership of nurses. When the nurses accept to wear the Catwoman costume and to be an IC, this introduces leadership, positive leadership. We talked about this earlier, a framework, because currently, as Mrs. Bourbonnais said, there is not one environment which has the same practices as another, but like Monsieur Genot said, like Mrs. Poirier said it, the intentions are all noble, but once we give training to the orderlies, when we give training to the nurses, there has to be a link between all of these wonderful elements. There has to be a framework, a quality framework, and quickly. One of the problems that we have in stage supervisions, because I've done this as well, is that what we're teaching, and sometimes when we go into the environment, there might be a guard, and sometimes there's a distance. So we have to prepare people to say, listen, in the environment, you're going to see these types of situations. It's going to be in the way that you have an attitude. And sometimes it's a copy paste, sometimes it's not the case. So the culture in the workplace often dictates the flavor or the color of the personnel once they get there. So on the one hand,
we work very hard for the training. We work very hard in implementing all this with the success and failures that come with it, but we also have to raise awareness and educate. It's a work in process. It's a process, unfortunately, still. So for a few years, positive deviance is what we celebrate, positive rebels. So the background is often around ageism, and we often hear the objectification to objectify people. It should not be something that we see. So the attitudes also, that is the key word here. Madame Poirier, a few years ago, 15 years ago, was saying the same thing we saw this morning, this idea of stimulating the potential of the clientele. We are there to avoid stereotypes. There's still some work to do, of course, but we still have to go after best practices and discourage things that are unacceptable. So we forget to say that 80% of the employees do good work, are really dedicated, and we often look at the 20% in the media and forget the 80%. Thank you.
Hello? No. Ça marche? OK. C'est intéressant.
It's interesting that there's more in English than in French.
Anglophone. Donc, peut-être on posera beaucoup plus de questions sur
Ask more questions. I don't know.
how to interact with people with memory issues appears to be very limited in all levels of a resident. This is for Mr. Genot. How does one improve this when the will to do so is rather passive?
So we're talking about training again here. For example, in training, independently of the training, there's basic content on treatment and how memory problems, and so how memory deteriorates. People must understand that when we understand the different mnemonic process, how they determine how they are preserved, and how we can interact with people with memory issues, preservation of emotional memory. People don't really maybe remember what's happening, but keep the emotional context and keep the how they remember how they felt, and so they'll smile because you had a good time. So this is content that we have to talk about. So I will finish with an example here. Christian Bobin, this French writer who his father had Alzheimer's, and he went to see his dad, and often he was in a home, but his father didn't recognize him. And one day his father said, "Listen, I don't know who you are, but I know you are the person I was waiting for." So emotional memory. So when you understand these things, you will interact much better with people who have memory issues. And maybe it's up to you. You can read the question. So we have a role for recommendation for the resident committee. We can't talk about the organization of work. So in the evolution of the partnership, should this standard not be revised? So I don't know who is that question is for, but is there somebody here who would like to answer, except maybe apart from Yvon? And so maybe I'm throwing out a number here in the presentations at about 30 committees, and they were all different, and so I have a few in mind, French and English, and I see that when Monsieur Brunet was saying yesterday, there are committees that are great to work with. It's really wonderful, but there's also some real nightmares in some committees where we have some issues with power relationships. So it's a different logic, a different way of seeing things. The logic for nursing and patient and residence committee are very different. So if we start to try to have a conflict between them, it will be difficult, and we will be crushed as Middletons, and we won't. So he mentioned the voice of residents, yes, but without being complacent. It's not very long that nursing will react. So I think there are strategies to develop in residence committees, but we hope the committees last a long time. They have to have a partnership role. They're very important. I remember what Monsieur Brunet said this morning, a role of partnership and not dictatorship or confrontation. That was not constructive. That's my opinion.
Je trouve que le partenariat est toujours bon. Je peux ajouter. Une autre question très...
One question, maybe for Danielle, or anybody can answer. Is it agreeable that a nurse pushes an orderly to give a bath to a resident that does not want to take a bath at all? No. I would say the same thing. No. Totally unacceptable. So what should he do? Yeah, but
Je vais juste reposer la question d'une autre façon.
Moi, j'aimerais. Est-ce que je peux.
if I can intervene on that, the risk sometimes is to say the person says she refused, and it is with respect that I will not insist on it. So we have to think about that and teach our teams when you talk about leadership or management or coaching the teams. Why is she refusing? It's too easy to say, well, no, and then you hide behind the issue of respect or values. Often they are not used correctly. We use it as a tool to. So why should I ask her in front of everybody? Should you want to take a bath? It's humiliating. I'm going to say no. I don't need one. Or can it be the tone of voice, my smell? Sometimes the nonverbal language? Is it the time of day? Is she hungry? Sometimes we are offered to take a bath and we don't think you have to go to the bathroom first. Do you want to take a shower maybe? Or do you need to go to the washroom first? All this has to be considered as well, and not just look at it as should we force the person or not. Also, we can add that the nurse should, in that case, see with the orderly why she's refusing. And if she insists, well, she should maybe try and explain or work with the orderly to understand the situation and justify it and accompany that orderly in the way they dispense care in a respectable way and that respects the needs of the user. So not just doing it without any work around that, around any efforts to understand and respect the rights of the users. And I think the users don't like to be pushed. So there's some partnership. There have to be some work in partnership. So honestly, I've seen cases where up to 4 people obligated forced the person to take a bath, and I find that horrible. I just want to add one thing. We react, of course. I remember a case where a lady was refusing a bath. I said, "How is it with the towel, with the towel at the sink? Why are you washing it like that?" The nurse says, "No, you need a real bath," and she doesn't want a real bath. She just wants to wash with a towel. So, in the training of the orderlies, and I think it's the same with auxiliary nurses and nurses. There's the exam of the module, of 60-hour module, and the relational project. It's a lab exam. It's exactly the same question we ask. We ask the personnel to intervene in a context like this one. And I agree with Nicole, creativity, see things differently, look further. That is part of the organizational culture. Yes, it may or may not be. So in the nurses training, there's 900 hours on care and 1,600 hours. So if we have a way to launch a PIB to put the orderlies at the front of the battlefield, maybe the auxiliary nurses can come and help with the strategy, to adapt the strategy and not just do it haphazardly. Yes, well, it's a very good question here for Anne.
Management receive training on how to manage effectively without using an authoritarian approach. Authoritarian leadership is recognized in other industries as being ineffectual. Why not in healthcare?
That's it.
I love that question.
C'est une bonne question.
It's a good question. Nurses that are in position of authority, first we have a problem with the training of nurses because the training of nurses is varied. Some have bachelors, some have higher degrees, and so those who are assistant nurses or team leads, or they can have different kinds of training, different experience. So it's difficult to say. But when we train them in terms of the bachelor's degree in university, the leadership we teach them is a leadership we call transformational leadership. So it is the contrary of authoritarian leadership. We teach them to work in partnership with people, not in an authoritarian way. So academically, that's not what we teach them. But where these teachers train that way, the organization and the managers, do they have this authoritarian attitude with them so that if the minister is an authoritarian with the directors, with the managers, the higher ups, and it just permeates down. So all the way down to the orderly. So there's something in the philosophy of the organization that can trickle down, something that can be a question of training as well. To talk about my experience, that's definitely not what we teach them, but between what we teach them and the influence of the environment, something happens, or people that are not trained well, or that we should to send back to training so that they can have a constructive and positive leadership. Very good question.
Malheureusement, il est à Trois-Rivières.
Fortunately, it's in Trois-Rivières, I think. We have a lot of requests to export that in our mission. We don't want to do a lot of carpe diems. Our approach, we want our approach to help others to do that, to go into CHSLD. And I was talking about the old folks home, that it's time to inspire other ways to do things. And so the offer is open. If people want to start one in Montreal, we want to help, but we can't do it all ourselves. We have one that opened last year. It's not Carpe Diem, but it's with the same philosophy. That's called Maison Intentionnelle. That is central. It is very small, but it made the news about 6 months ago, and I have a video I can maybe share with the website if people want to live there. There won't be enough room. Well, c'est
Very small, c'est très petit.
It's very small. We can put that on our website, but I can share this information. So it's like Carpe Diem. It's very small, but one of them is open in Montreal, and I hope there will be others. Last question. Where we can have both things. We want to, for example, change the ventilation, and they also want to make a change when the diaper changes before meals. Before meals. Yes, before. So do we agree that there are opportunism in these ideas of improving the ventilation? It's a political opportunism. So in terms of public opinion, I don't know if it's really there, but changing the diapers in 2018, because when we did some training, when you don't use the training, the diapers correctly, there's 25 cents teaching training because they're residents and not patients. So it's not complicated. That said, we're working hard to be able to improve this culture, and we won't be able to fix that tomorrow, but even if the idea of Monsieur Legault seems interesting, it's been more than 5 years now, but it's a process that is more long-term. So let's think about culture, about leadership, about the different work, the types of work we can do, and what needs to be done. And so before we finish, I'm very happy. It's really noon, and we were able to do the whole panel. So bravo, everybody. I want to thank the panelists as well. And really, it was great, and there was a lot of interesting information. And now it is lunchtime, and I think Helen has something to add.